Hello and welcome to the Nextflow podcast. You're listening to episode 55 going out in February 2026, and this episode is all about Terraform and the use of Terraform within the Seqera platform. This is a new project. It's a very new thing we've spun up within Seqera to help you with your infrastructure around Seqera. And to tell us all about it and why we think it's cool and why we think you should care, I've got two guests on today, Ken and Adam. Thanks very much for joining me, both of you. Adam Talbot, you are the Scientific Services Lead, and Ken Brewer is the Scientific Solutions Lead at Seqera. I had to write those down because there was no way I was going to remember who was who. Yeah, thank you for joining, both of you. Just before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about what you do at Seqera? So maybe, Ken, you can lead us off.
Sure. So I, as the Solutions Lead at Seqera, I head up our pre-sales function. So I mostly work with new customers who are evaluating Seqera to understand, like, how do they deploy it? How do they configure it? Where can they get value? When I first joined Seqera, I was actually on the community team. I was doing developer relations, heavily involved in the NF Core community and running hackathons. And that's something that I'm still involved in, although that's not my full-time job anymore.
Yeah, I'm a Scientific Services Lead, which I'm in charge of small team of people who basically provide bioinformatics engineers for hire. So we've got so much expertise here in Seqera, and a lot of people, customers and new customers and existing customers, want to, engage with us. So things like helping people set up infrastructure, building pipelines, building automations, that sort of thing, to help them get the most out of Nextflow.
Both of you have been around in Nextflow and NF Core for years at this point. Ken, you're in the core team for NF Core, and Adam, you're a maintainers team, right?
Maintainer, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like you're familiar faces at this point. Great stuff. So, Adam, maybe you can just kind of give us a bit of an intro as to what we're talking about today. How does this all kind of fit into the picture around Nextflow?
Yeah, cool. One of the things that really attracted me to Nextflow when I first started was it's got this really good ability to, we say write your pipeline once and then deploy many times. You write your pipelines as code, and then you set up how your pipeline's going to run, where they're going to run via configuration. So it neatly separates out infrastructure from the actual pipeline tool. This is, invaluable. It means you can sort of write a Nextflow pipeline and put it on your Slurm cluster, your AWS batch environment, your Kubernetes environment, just by changing some configuration settings. It's probably its strongest feature is how things like NF Core, how they're built. Everyone writes the same pipelines. The kind of the challenges we then face are, you've got a great pipeline. How do I set up that configuration to make sure it's just correctly set up? And then how do I make sure the infrastructure underneath it is sort of reliable, trustable? I know exactly what went in there and how it works. And, if you're at a university, you've probably never had to experience this because you've got an IT team who are building you a great big HPC cluster and maintaining it for you 24/7. But as Nextflow starts to get used by more and more, a wider variety of people, you just see so much more diversity. And things like smaller teams where they're having to administer their own cloud environment, bigger enterprise units where they're like the DevOps is a completely different country and working a different way. And so we've kind of got this two-phase problem now where we've got bioinformaticians writing great Nextflow pipelines, and then they need somewhere to run it and deploy it. And so we need to stand up this infrastructure ahead of time. So this is really where tools like Seqera and Terraform and all these things start to come into play, as we need good tooling. The same tooling we've had with Nextflow, we need to have it for infrastructure as well.
Yeah. And Ken, this is basically something you lived through, right? Prior to joining Seqera.
Yeah, absolutely. Like my first role after finishing my PhD was at a small biotech startup, Profound Therapeutics. I was like the second computational hire, and my first project was like figure out how we're going to do bioinformatics at scale. And that's when I fell in love with Nextflow and NF Core. It was, at least in my view, the superior options among all the things that I compared. And not too long after like adopting Nextflow and then starting on the journey of one of the first 20-something customers of Seqera's, which was a small software startup that had just showed up not long after like I started my Nextflow journey. I found myself in a position where I was trying to write an AlphaFold pipeline for internal use by company engineers. And there's just a lot of headaches around how the data gets staged and managed. This was before Seqera had come out with Fusion, and I was doing a lot of iteration on the infrastructure, trying to figure out like how do we get these massive amounts of data staged in a performant way so we can like run our pipelines efficiently. And I was clicking through the Seqera interface. Like Batch Forge was like an incredible utility for like doing that iteration, but it just felt like there was something not quite right in terms of like how often I was clicking through the same things over and over again. So I came across a tool called Terraform. I was doing searching about like, hey, what is the best practices for infrastructure like management, and I also discovered that a different Seqera customer called Helix had put together sort of like a homegrown fan-made version of a Terraform provider that had like a couple of key things made ready into Terraform, and that's kind of when I started experimenting with Terraform for Seqera as developed by this other customer. And not long after I did that experimentation, I ended up changing to a new role. I joined GeneDx, which is a large clinical diagnostics company with like a very mature DevOps practice, and Terraform was very core to the way everything was happening. Basically, anytime you wanted to make changes in the AWS account, it was something that was almost like democratic in terms of like who could make infrastructure changes, because you would make infrastructure changes by simply opening pull requests to like the central GitHub repo that describes all of your infrastructure. And then once you've done that, someone else like sees what the changes will cause in Terraform console output, and then someone can approve the pull request, and when it gets merged, it gets applied. And so I really, really wanted to tap into all of this beautiful goodness of Terraform with our Seqera configuration, because a lot of the things that I was building to plug into Seqera were being built in Terraform, like AWS users and credentials and policies and permissions. I just wanted to easily take them from AWS and drop them straight into like Seqera.
Makes a lot of sense if you're kind of living in that Terraform ecosystem already. Yeah. And so like, I mean, you talked about the platform web UI with kind of lots of clicking and click ops. We've also got like other ways to access Seqera Platform. There's the CLI, there's the Python library Seqera kit, and then the low level API itself. Like where do they fit into all this? Is Terraform? I guess Terraform is kind of based on top of the API, or how do those kind of puzzle pieces fit together?
So yeah, Seqera is ultimately a web server with strong APIs that allow you to just deploy things like compute environments or credentials or things and put them onto Seqera Platform. Because it has a standard open API spec, you can integrate with it a bunch of ways. Whatever you're doing, you're still interacting with the API. If you click the interface, you're interacting with the API. If you then use a CLI, you're doing the same thing, and so on. And Terraform uses those same APIs. The difference really is your user experience. So with the interface, it is great for experimentation and trying things out. You can click, and off you go. But there's no version control. There's no like snapshot of what you did and how you did it. The CLI is the next layer up. So, for my petition, this is very familiar territory. They've got a terminal. They type a command in, TW compute environments add, and then add some specifications onto that CLI command. What will then happen is the CLI will go off and call those APIs, which then Seqera Platform on the other end starts doing all the work in the background. That's good. That's a really great start, and it helps you just have that kind of imperative style of just type this and do this for me. In the scientific development team, we were finding that we needed something a bit more reproducible. And we actually developed Seqera Kit, which is a wrapper around the Tower CLI, which basically declares all the Tower CLI commands you want to run in order. So, for example, you say, hey, I want to create a workspace, add these users, create these compute environments, add these pipelines, launch these pipelines. And you can just do it in one big YAML file you write, and then just Seqera kit run that. And it's basically going through the YAML file and running the Tower CLI, each one in turn.
This feels kind of familiar from the Nextflow story around bioinformatics. Like bioinformatics of running commands and then looking in your bash history and then, kind of...
Absolutely.
Now, did anyone ever write a Nextflow pipeline to run the Seqera CLI? It would be very meta.
Yes, we did. I think we've done that. Of course we have. I think we've done that and then launched it on the platform and all sorts of weird things, like how many Russian dolls can we go like down to the bottom level? I mean, it kind of highlights the problem, which is we're not really writing down what you did. It tells you exactly what you want to do, but it doesn't give you a nice log of how you did it, when you did it, why you did it. And that's something that, is a real problem in infrastructure. We have this concept in infrastructure called drift. So if you stand up a load of compute environments using really controlled scripts and then an SOP and all these precise things, and then somebody comes along and just clicks and changes some settings in the background, you don't know they've done that. And so if you need to, stand up that resource again, you've got no record of it. So we wanted to sort of move to the next step. People were pushing Seqera Kit really far. And we were finding more and more feature requests coming in that were just like basically people asking for Terraform. So Terraform is the industry standard for infrastructure as code. I mean, there are other things, but Terraform by far is the number one. And yeah, the parallels with Nextflow are pretty strong. What Nextflow did for bioinformatics, Terraform did for infrastructure management.
Can you tell us a little bit about Terraform? I mean, I don't know very much about it personally, so this is kind of also interesting for me. I know it was developed by HashiCorp, right? And it's open source, and I think they have a kind of... I look at them sometimes because they have a similar sort of setup to us at Seqera, where they're a company with commercial products built on top of an open source foundation, and they also happen to have really nice websites, which I quite admire. But tell us a little bit about that story of what Terraform is and what world that came from.
Terraform really came from this kind of broader industry challenges around infrastructure change management. And the fact that, like, if you want to go ahead and make changes to your infrastructure, the way to do it was to have like sort of like long guides and how-tos of how you would do the deployment step by step, generate a secret here, go ahead and drop it into a user interface over there, then like take that on to the next step. And so this is a lot of like very manual hands-on processes, which is difficult to do in a reproducible and reliable fashion. So I kind of see Terraform very much kind of like as a sister to Nextflow. Because one of the things that Terraform does really well is that it will create the DAG, the directed acyclic graph of your infrastructure, where like this piece of infrastructure depends on this piece of infrastructure, which depends on this piece of infrastructure. And then if I make a change to this AWS entity, this is everything that depends on it that needs to be sort of recreated and rebuilt. So it kind of gives you essentially like Nextflow resume like functionality for your infrastructure configurations and your infrastructure changes. And that's kind of like the really powerful utility that's kind of led so much of like the tech world to adopt it as like, hey, this is the tool that we need for how we are managing and tracking our changes for infrastructure.
Nice. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I see the attraction.
And the other thing that I think kind of has made Terraform such a strong utility is that it is platform agnostic. AWS, for example, they have an SDK, but if you're using the AWS SDK or AWS CloudFormation templates, that's like a one infrastructure provider solution. And often when you're doing infrastructure, you're not doing just one piece of infrastructure that you're managing. You're managing how these different pieces play together. You might be creating like a GitHub secret that you need to bring into your AWS in a certain way, or creating an AWS user and policies that you need to be using in Seqera. Terraform gives you a common language to track the dependencies of these different platforms on each other in a way that doesn't require you to write a bunch of custom bash scripts. And kind of another piece of Terraform is that a lot of people have, including companies, have invested effort into writing Terraform providers. And a Terraform provider is essentially all of the information that Terraform needs to know how to interact with the API in a programmatic way to add, create, delete, and modify different objects or resources. And these providers, you can almost think of like an NF Core module where someone writes it once and then anybody can just pull that provider and then use it in their own infrastructure without needing to write a bunch of boilerplate stuff around like, this is how Terraform is supposed to do stuff. One last thing to mention about Terraform that I think is a really powerful utility is that it's not imperative where you kind of like need to go through step by step and say, things need to be done in this order. It's declarative. And that means you simply declare what your desired end state is, and then Terraform will go through the process of figuring out like how to do the changes and in what order they need to happen in order to give you your final end state.
Makes sense. Nice. Okay, if I'm running on my laptop and I'm just sort of doing small scale stuff, I don't need this. And if I've already got an HPC cluster which is set up for me, then I probably don't need this. What kind of use cases do you see coming up for this?
Yeah, so a couple of examples of people who will really typically care about this. Let's say you are a large academic medical center and you're trying to support the deployment of Seqera Platform workspaces to all of the labs in your university who are running bioinformatics workflows. There's a lot of like stuff that you're going to need to click through if you want to do that manually. Like for, let's say you've got 50 labs. You need to make sure they all have like separate isolated workspaces, that they have certain levels of like cloud options and permissions in each of those, that they have like the appropriate credentials. You don't want to have to manually click your way through that. So instead, with Terraform, you can create a module that describes this is what a lab's Seqera infrastructure is supposed to look like. And these are like the inputs and variables that I need. And I want to deploy this lab workspace module 50 times for each of these different people. Another example might be like clinical diagnostics companies. A lot of times the way they are setting up their Seqera infrastructure is going to be very locked down, where if you are running like the production genetic testing, essentially you only want to be able to make changes with multiple levels of approval to how that infrastructure is set up and how the Seqera area is like permission. You essentially don't want to have any admin users who's allowed to just go in and make changes without approval. Instead, there's like one sort of set of admin token credentials that are going to be managed by Terraform. So any change is going to have multiple sets of eyes on it before you're changing how like the pipelines and everything is set up. You could also imagine you're an IT department, like for a pharma company, and you do all of your work in Terraform for creating things, and then some clinical team starts using Seqera Platform. You want to get them up and running, but you want to do it in a way that fits your existing tooling and your flow of how you're doing your infrastructure change management. Like Seqera's Terraform provider is going to be kind of like your solution. And I guess one other like example of someone who would like really care about this is people who are doing infrastructure benchmarking. And this kind of takes us back to like what originally got me interested in Terraform, where I was trying to find like, hey, what's the best way to run these jobs at scale, not just on like the pipeline optimization front, but on like the infrastructure optimization front. And this is kind of where Terraform will be really helpful.
I found it very powerful because Terraform has that caching mechanism kind of similar to Nextflow. It will only replace, update resources as I modify them. So if I need to twiddle with infrastructure and get it just right, like it's way easier to sort of keep twiddling the numbers in Terraform and hit Terraform apply, and it will only change the resources that I've actually modified. At the end of it, I've got a perfect, reproducible piece of code I can share with someone and say, this is the optimum settings for you. Such a big impact in the cloud because the resources are temporary, like they're designed to be disposable. They're capital, not pets, right? And so you should be building them in such a way you can destroy them every couple of days and build them up again and not care, and it's fine.
Poor cows.
I think that is the most sad I have felt about killing infrastructure, Adam. So thank you for that moment.
Okay, so I can see how it's useful for tweaking things, for experimentation, for benchmarking, for reproducibility. We have a lot of people, especially in companies who have dev and or staging and production instances. I'm guessing it's probably good then as well because you can kind of mirror stuff. Is that?
It's got a really cool feature called variables. So what you end up doing is going, Terraform apply vars file development.tfvars, and it goes and deploys it all onto your development environment. And then you write another tfvars file for your staging environment, Terraform apply that one, then Terraform apply production. And it's running exactly the same code, but 3 times with different parameters. And it saves where it got to and how it did them for all of those different environments. And so then you can go back to them. And this is really useful for, you can roll out a change to development, make sure it works, then roll it out to staging, check it works in a near production environment, and then roll it out to production.
Okay, so I feel like I've got a fairly good picture of what it's useful for. So when you're talking about standing up the Seqera part of things, are we talking about deploying enterprise installations of Seqera, or is it more like kind of bits within Seqera? Like what kind of primary objects within Seqera are configuring within Terraform?
There's both. If you're doing an enterprise install of Seqera, and just to clarify, this means like you're standing up the actual Seqera application within your own infrastructure, then a lot of times you might be using Terraform to build the infrastructure the Seqera application is going to run on. But what the Seqera provider is specifically designed for managing everything that happens inside the Seqera application. So after you've already stood up your Seqera application, or if you're running on cloud.seqera.io, how do you manage all of like the orgs and workspaces, the teams, credentials, pipelines, studios, all of those different things that Seqera Platform that you can click through and create? Those are the things that the Seqera Terraform provider is designed to help you with.
Nice, because that was a point of confusion for me for a while, because we have a Terraform thing for actually deploying, and that's what I thought. So it's 2 different Terraform use cases here, one for installing Seqera itself, and then one for kind of using Seqera Platform.
Terraform is the standard for infrastructure, so if you want to stand up Seqera Platform itself, you're going to probably be using Terraform at some point to get Seqera Platform stood up. But then once you've done that, you can use the Seqera provider, which is a Terraform library for Seqera, and that's the tool you'll be using.
As someone who's never used Terraform before, if I want to use this today, what do I do? What are the steps I go through?
Yeah. So Terraform is a CLI application written in Go. First thing you're going to do is open up a code repository. So, and you're going to create a main.tf file. Again, another parallel with Nextflow. The main.tf file, it's kind of similar syntax to Nextflow configuration in that you have like the name of a scope and then an open curly brace and then, the contents, and then closes and then the next sort of scope you go into. So the first one you're probably going to write is one called Terraform. You're going to open the curly brace, and in there is going to be something saying providers, required providers, and you're going to say, I want the Seqera provider. That's the thing I need. You then, when in your repo, you can do Terraform init, and Terraform will go and fetch the Seqera provider from the registry, pull it down, have a local version. It will sort of do a lock file and to make sure you got a static version. So The recommended thing is to, snapshot a version, say we're going to use version 0.26.5, the current version, and then off you go. So you configure some authentication, make sure you can talk to Seqera Platform using your authentication token, which you can provide, in a secret way with Terraform. And then you're going to start writing your resources. First thing you want to create is an organization. So you would do resource, Seqera_organization, and then you give it a name. So you say, hey, I want it to be called my org. So inside that scope is the settings, name, logo, that sort of thing. Then close that underneath the next one. You do resource again, and you maybe want to create a workspace. So resource Seqera_workspace, my workspace. Give it some details. You give it some settings, that you want to put in your workspace. And then you might do like organization ID. And then what you'll do is you'll go myorg.id. Okay. And so exactly, it's going to read it in from that organization resource. So then come out of, writing my text, and I go on the command line, I write Terraform plan. Terraform goes away, it looks at your resources and says, hey, I need to create an organization, I need to create a workspace. Firstly, it checks if it's done it before. And if it hasn't done it before, it'll create it fresh. Okay. So it knows that the workspace needs the ID, so it will know to do the organization first, goes to the Seqera API, creates an organization. Then it goes and creates the workspace using that ID. And there you are. You've got a workspace set up.
And you said it checks if it exists already. So if the organization existed already, but the workspace didn't, it's not going to like delete the existing organization and recreate it. It's just going to say, yes, I found it. This is the ID that already exists.
Exactly.
And change any settings, I guess, if they've changed.
Right. So it saves a state file. The state file is kind of, the entire state of your infrastructure. And it's quite an important file. You need to keep it secure. And you also need to keep it like shared between anytime you run Terraform. Otherwise, you'll just be standing up new instances everywhere. That will save the workspace details and say, this workspace is created here, or this organization is created here. If I then go, if I run the command a second time, the first thing Terraform will do is check against that state file. Depending on the resource, it might also go up to the Seqera API, check that those resources haven't changed and check for drift. So in case someone's changed the name or something of the resource on the remote side. And then if there's a difference in the terminal, it'll give you all the resources that need to be modified before if you were to run it again. So it'll say, hey, are you sure you want to do this? I'm going to delete this resource. I'm going to update this resource. I'm going to, create this new resource. Yes or no. And so it can give you that sanity check before you do it yourself.
That's nice. Especially when you're like deleting stuff. It's good to have a confirmation step. Yeah.
Well, there's one more trick up its sleeve, which is there's a destroy command. So if you want to tear down your resources and you want to make sure you don't leave anything lying around, all the horror stories of having an EC2, Amazon EC2, racking up a $23,000 bill or something, you can make sure that doesn't happen because you do Terraform apply destroy, and it'll just bring everything down for you,
making all of the sad cattle go away.
How did he do, Ken? Did he miss anything?
No, that's like a really good summary. Like I think the key takeaways is like when you write the Terraform, you describe your desired end state, then you've got this plan and apply loop like in GitHub Actions, where when you open a pull request, you do the plan to see what this changes do, and then when a change gets merged, then you actually apply the changes.
Oh, that's nice. I like that. A bit less CLI again and a bit more automation.
It really brings, Ken mentioned change control earlier, and it kind of nicely brings it into the software development lifecycle. And it's a really nice sort of flow that matches the sort of what the auditors would require.
I was going to say, you can go and do git blame on any part of infrastructure and see who changed it and why.
Exactly.
Yeah, and this support for regulated environments was a key part of why Seqera decided to invest in building a Terraform provider. That and the fact that as soon as I joined Seqera, like I was a man on a mission that I needed a Seqera Terraform provider, and I started raising a ruckus like, "Hey, when are we getting a Terraform provider? When are we getting the Terraform provider?"
Reminds me a little bit of that. I see it go around LinkedIn. I'm not sure it's true, but it's the story of someone joining a company, fixing one bug, and then quitting. It's like, I hope that doesn't apply
Yes.
to you too.
No plans to do anything of that sort.
We both use it in our day-to-day now. I don't know about you, Ken, but like I know you use it to stand up demo environments, things like, here's what your Seqera platform could look like. And I use it a lot for like tight integration, like when people have weird requirements, basically they need to set up some sort of confusing cloud environment and tie it to Seqera. And that's another real strength of Terraform. We've already mentioned it, but you can bring in other providers. So you're not limited to just Seqera. You say, bring in the AWS provider, create me the IAM user that Seqera is going to be, and then use those credentials in Seqera Platform. So it's just a really strong tool for this infrastructure management.
Nice. Is there anything like, is there any gotchas that you've just kind of, potholes you stood in with this? Like, is there any kind of common pitfalls?
There's several ways. So Terraform can be a very good rake to step on if you're not careful. You need to be sure that you're never hard coding secrets. And Terraform does have support for like labeling certain values as sensitive. But one thing that need to be especially protected is your state file. And so typically, if you're going to be working as a team on a set of Terraform deployments, you'll set up some sort of like remote state, which could be S3, it could be HashiCorp's own Terraform solution. Other things is like just being careful about the variables. Anything that's a secret, you'll typically want to inject an environment variable rather than a TF-vars file.
Or it could be a resource. It could be a resource and you go and get it. So one password have a resource so you can go get it from one password as part of your code, which is quite cool.
I was actually thinking of mentioning one password. The way you were talking about the lost state file that reminded me of kind of sharing passwords within a team.
Yeah, and then that's actually how I am deploying demos right now. Like I have my Seqera token in 1Password, and I import it via the 1Password provider to use for Seqera deployment. It's all very, very, it all works together so nicely. I think another really important thing about best practices is you don't really want to mix your management approaches for like Terraform versus UI. I think what works well is to kind of decide ahead of time, these are the things that I'm going to manage with Terraform, and these are the things that my users are going to do themselves. So one clean division might be, I'm going to use Terraform to create workspaces, create credentials, and create compute environments. But I'm going to choose to leave like the pipeline launchpad as something that my users can go wild on and do whatever they want. Or if you're like in a regulated environment, then you might decide actually the pipeline launchpad, that is a protected entity. And so I want to have that be terraformed as well. If you end up mixing the approaches, you get a lot of that drift that Adam was talking about.
Something we've pushed on Seqera Platform fairly recently is fine-grained authorization, where we can define more specifically what different user roles can do and can't do. Does that fit in here? Can you kind of like use fine-grained authorization to remove that permission from certain user groups? Apologies if you don't know the answer and I've just sprung this on you.
I don't know. Probably is the answer. So we don't have user management. That's one of our limitations in the Terraform provider at the moment. So it's something we're working on, and will be ready by sort of the first stable release, but is not quite there yet. In theory, this is something that we like to have in the provider, but really large enterprise organizations, they're going to start managing their roles with, their provider, things like Microsoft Entra or Okta and things like that. So it starts to, there's a blurry line of like this moving from DevOps into IT, and someone's got to make a Terraform for IT management, clearly, but not me. So
Adam, you mentioned just now that coming up to the first release, like this is all very new still. Like, how long has the Terraform provider been around for, and what's the usage and adoption been like so far?
6 months, maybe, but I think it's about 6 months. There's been a load of iterations though. We've like done so many releases and things.
We started with a stealth release to the Terraform registry, where we just didn't announce that. And then I think the official announcement of it happened at the Nextflow Summit, where Evan announced that among other new features. And we've had some customers who have started engaging with it and started like testing it out, providing feedback about like, hey, the way this particular resource works is like frustrating or doesn't fit our flow. And our DevOps team has been like hard at work at like incorporating that feedback and getting new versions of the provider out the door. And now it feels like it's definitely in like a very usable and functional state. Like Adam said, the two of us are using it almost daily in terms of like how often we're like iterating on Seqera things. And so we're very eager right now for anyone who's managing their Seqera platform infrastructure who thinks this might fit some of their use cases to give it a try and provide feedback while we work on these additional iterations.
If you're learning Terraform for the first time, the AI is very good at writing Terraform because it's very fixed syntax and quite declarative, like Ken said. Like AI just seems to take to it like a duck to water and just write a bunch of quite good Terraform, which you can then read.
And so there's the Terraform registry, I think you called it. Is that the best approach if people want to try this out today?
Yeah, there's a Terraform registry which has essentially the auto-generated documentation from the code. It says, you know, here's all the resources. It's like the API documentation. It's very precise, but a bit, you know, not the easiest to read. If you go to the GitHub repo, which is Seqera Labs /Terraform-provider-Seqera, that's where the provider is. And there's a lot more documentation in there. There's some guidance, best practices. There's also a lot of examples for different cloud providers, different environments.
I do want to say though, like, it brings me just an incredible amount of joy to see Seqera Labs /Terraform-provider/Seqera. I joined Seqera as like a man on a mission. This was a thing that I've wanted like for a good 2 or 3 years before joining, and then it took a year and a half of shaking trees and rallying support, and it feels so good to finally have this in the hands of customers and having people already to see the value of bringing these very Nextflow like approach to infrastructure and using that tooling within Seqera. It just kind of it brings a lot of sort of like open source compatibility happiness to like how I'm doing my changes these days.
That's good. All right. Well, from the chatter I've seen around this Terraform provider so far, it's still early days, but people seem really excited about it. You guys seem really excited about it, and I'm kind of like maybe thinking to myself, I need to go and try it out.
Especially, Phil, if you could set up a Terraform automation that interacts with your smart home devices. I expect some sort of smart home integration /Terraform setup from you.
There must be a home assistant provider. That ecosystem is like big enough. It must someone will have done
Someone's
it
done
already.
it. Someone's done it.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much, guys, for bringing enthusiasm, for bringing a drive and making this actually happen on behalf of the community. And thanks for joining me today on the podcast. It's been really fun. I've actually learned a lot about this, so it's good.
Thanks, Phil.
Great stuff.
Great to be
Thanks,
here.
Phil.
Cheers, all.